This is Austin with Onewheel Parts, and today I'm going to show you how to completely waterproof your Onewheel XR. The tools needed will all be included in our Onewheel XR Waterproofing Kit located at onewheelparts.com. There will be a link down in the description. So let's go ahead and get everything prepped. What I like to do first is go ahead and open up our silicone. What we want to do is cut this tip at a 45-degree angle. You can either use a pair of scissors or a razor blade. We cut it at a 45-degree angle rather than straight on because there are going to be some nooks and crannies that we need to get it into. Be sure not to cut the hole too small or too big. It should be between 1 to 2 millimeters big as far as the flow rate that'll come out. If you cut it too big, it'll be really difficult to get into the smaller areas, and too small will just strain your fingers and take a really long time. So let's go ahead, unscrew the cap, press it into the hole to break that aluminum seal on there. And it might start flowing out a little bit, so quickly go ahead and screw that cap on, and you should be all good to go. So after we've opened up our silicone, what we want to do is go ahead, take some isopropyl alcohol and a paper towel, and go ahead and wipe down every single bit of your controller and battery. Really make sure to get into some of those tighter areas where no dirt is left, that way the silicone can stick to it. Sometimes your controller or your battery will be stained with dirt or even like creased with abrasions on it, and it looks like it's still dirty and you won't be able to rub anything off. Just go ahead and rub those areas until the paper towel comes off clean after rubbing it. That way, the silicone will stick. So what I find is easiest is to just go ahead and start off with the controller. Let's just take our silicone here, and I'm going to give a quick rundown of sort of how to apply it. So we're going to be doing a quick line here across the side. We're going to eventually do that line all the way across the perimeter of this controller there, just along that seal where the metal meets the plastic. Go ahead and apply it so that the silicone is touching both of the metal, the rubber, and the plastic as well. This is going to create a full seal along that edge, that way no water can get in there if there are any imperfections with that rubber seal. Try not to apply too much as it might drip down and cause very much issues when we put it back into the rails. There's a certain way we have to put it back into the rails, which I'll show you later as well. But as you can see here, a bunch of it is dripped down onto the side. That's going to make it very difficult if we put too much. Just make sure there are no air gaps or anything like that. Seal up everything. See here, I'm missing a few spots where it's not on the plastic, it's only on the metal and the rubber. It's not going to be good. It won't seal completely. Make sure it's touching all of those without getting too much on the sides. That way it'll still fit back into the rails and not scrape that silicone off when we put it back in. Good thing to note as well, sometimes the rubber there around the headlight area will get folded down. Just go ahead and fill that entirely up with silicone and press it down a little bit. That way we don't run the risk of it coming loose again, ripping our silicone barrier or anything like that. Also be careful around screw holes. Don't try to fill those up with silicone. It could come loose and rip it off of the seal whenever we screw something back into it. So we can just go around the entire perimeter first, making sure not to put too much or too little, ensuring that it's touching all three of those layers. We should be good to go to move on to the next step. Now we can just move on to the headlight as well. This one we really don't want a bunch of silicone dripping down off of it onto the headlight, so be sure not to use too much. Just go ahead and seal up all 4 edges of that headlight, as well as the 5 screws on the bottom there underneath it. When doing the back, we really want to make sure we fill in the entirety of that little lip on the controller plug sides. Just really fill that up with silicone. Make sure not to use too much though, as the controller may not be able to plug back in. Can be kind of hard to get your tip down in there underneath where the controller meets that metal. So just go ahead and really fill that up, as well as go ahead and take those 4 screws on the back. Just outline the perimeter of those in silicone as well. And we should be able to move on to the 4 screws on the back here as well, or 5 screws. There's that little hole right there that has a screw in it. Just make sure to cover those screw heads. Don't go super overboard with it. Just make sure you cover the tops of them. That way no water, if it gets on top, is going to leak into there. And we can also do the bottom and sides of the headlight here. We also want to go around the controller plugs as well as these little hex rings on the back as well. Just go around the perimeter of them where they meet the controller box, as well as on the top neck where the ring meets the actual plug. Try not to get a bunch of silicone super high up on there, that way we can still screw in the controller and the motor plugs with ease. And then around the controller gaskets for the motor and battery plug, we just want to fill those in with silicone as well to add an extra layer of waterproofing. Give that around 30 or 40 minutes to dry, and then we can move on to the top of the controller. We're going to do the 5 bottoms of the screws underneath the headlight right here, as well as the bottoms of the 5 screws that we did on the other side as well, towards the top of the controller. Go ahead and get those 5 rivets as well that are on the top, just to make sure that no water can leak in through those rivet holes. Now we can move on to the important part of the liquid silicone after everything's dried. This is arguably one of the most tricky steps because you can get a bunch of silicone on your pins and have to scrape them off. So take your syringe, fill it up a little bit. You don't want to squirt too much in there. Go ahead and tilt your controller vertically. I like to start with the biggest plug just to get a feel for it before we move on to the smaller ones. And just squirt quite a bit in there. Don't fill it up all the way to the top. Please do not do that. What we want to do is just cover the entire bottom base of those pins with the silicone here. Feel free to move it around in different directions. That way it covers and coats all of it. And what we're going to do now is soak up all of the excess with that syringe as well. That way there's not a ton of it sitting in there and drying, and our connector can make good plugs with those pins. And we just need to repeat this process for the other 5 plugs. For these 2 smaller ones, what I find is easiest is to put the needle right on the edge of there and just have it drip down in there. Really be careful to try not to put too much in these. If you fully cover them up, it can be a big pain to try and remove the silicone from those pins, and you may have to end up getting a new controller. Just be very careful. Don't put a super ton of excess in there. Be sure to wiggle it around to get all of that in there, and make sure to suck up the excess very carefully. Give this around 30 to 40 minutes to dry as well, and then we can flip it over on its side and start with the power plug. power plug is going to be one of the easiest ones to do just because the pins are super large and spaced out. We can just squirt it in, same process as the other one, and then once all the bottom is coated, we can just go ahead and suck it back up. Now we can get started on waterproofing our battery. Same thing as the controller, we're going to go around the perimeter here with a layer of silicone, ensuring that we're touching the plastic, the metal, and that rubber seal, as well as getting these 5 screws on the top. We can go ahead and flip it over. We're going to be sure to get the headlight and the 5 screws located here. As well as squirting silicone onto these connector plugs in this area, as well as sort of where all of those wires come out. So we can take our silicone and get started. This area can be a little bit rough as it's where all the rocks, sand, and leaves sort of hit the battery box. You can lay it on a little bit thicker here, that's what I like to do just to ensure extra safety. Go ahead and get those same screw holes on the top as well. There should be a few of them just lining the entire perimeter, as well as the 5 for the underside near the headlight. Same process for this headlight on the back as well as with the front. Same layer of silicone in the same spots, as well as getting those 5 screws located underneath as well. There's also going to be those same 6 screws as we're on the front, sort of sandwiching on the sides of the controller here. I filled the other 2 in the last clip, but there are 2 more right there on the left and right side that we're going to need to get. Now we can move on to the back where all the rocks hit. There's going to be 4 screw heads we're going to need to do the same thing to, as well as get this ring that comes for the cable that plugs into the controller. We're going to need to seal that up where all the threads are essentially. There's going to be one that's directly touching the plastic, there's going to be one a little bit halfway on the ring, and then there's going to be where the ring connects to the cable coming out. Don't worry about getting it all on one side. Go ahead, get as much as you can on one side, flip it over, and do the same thing on the other. That way we get a full 360-degree coverage over that ring. Now we can move on to doing the plug. What I find is easiest is sort of the same thing with that ring. Go around on one side of that controller, flip it over, and get the other side. For where all those wires come out, I find it's really easy to just squirt a whole bunch in there and then move the wires around to get it to sit and flow back on the inside. Just like that, just squirt a ton in, and then anywhere that you see that the cable isn't encased in waterproofing already, I just like to go over with a thin layer of silicone on where those wires actually meet the plug. Make sure to have this dry like this, otherwise the silicone can flow and fill off. For these two sort of rubber things on the back, don't just stick the applicator in there and squeeze. That's a direct line into the actual battery box. Just go ahead, insert it, fill it up a little bit, and pull out. As you can see here, I missed a little bit on that ring. See how there's no silicone coverage where it meets the battery box? It's always good to go through and inspect after everything is dried and touch up any spots that may be missing. I'm going to give you guys a few examples of what it looks like, what to look out for, where to reseal it. So just give your controller a quick visual inspection on all fronts, rotate it around, make sure you're not missing anything big. Everything on the back here looks pretty good. On the side here, there is a little bit that I'm missing right there again. We want to make sure we get that it's not touching the plastic. The top here, I didn't quite push it down enough or put enough silicone in there, so it'll actually flap down. I'll need to go back in and reseal that. See in the corner there where my thumb is, I missed a big portion. I'll need to go in and put some silicone over that. I think that's about it for the controller there. Headlight's looking good. Let's check the top here on the screw holes. Nope, there's a big chunk missing out of that screw. I'm going to need to go through and put some silicone on that. We can do the same thing. See here on the controller, even something that small and that little of a hole will fail your waterproofing. Water will be able to get in there and eventually destroy your board if you're riding it through heavy amounts of water. Just go ahead, dab a little bit on the spots you missed and you should be good. We're going to do the same thing with the battery as well. There'll be a few more examples here. The back side's looking fairly good. The ring that I touched up is looking good now as well. Just make sure to go around the entirety of it. Make sure you're not missing anything. Any sort of small leak can cause your board to fail. Edges here are looking good. Now we can inspect this area with the cables. Everything's looking pretty sealed up here. Perfect, so now we can get on to testing to see if our boards are waterproof. Near the headlight on the controller and the battery, there is this rubber seal. Just go ahead and start peeling it off. It can be a little bit difficult, so use the included pick to get it started, and then you can just pull those both off with your finger. Now we need to go ahead and clean all the extra adhesive left behind by them off. So you can see here, just get one of the alcohol swabs included. Make sure to scrape all of that old adhesive off of there so the new ones can stick really well. Now we can start testing to see if our waterproofing is correct. So go ahead and take your little waterproof tester, squeeze it, and make sure you press it very firmly up against that hole and release it. See here, I don't have it on quite all the way and it's sort of inflating a little bit. It's not really working. Make sure that it ensures a nice tight seal, and if your board is waterproofed, it'll stay. So go ahead and give it a compress. I'm going to stick it on here, making sure that everything is nice and flush with that. And if it stays and doesn't slowly inflate, your board is fully waterproofed. If it does start inflating very slowly, like air is leaking out, you might even be able to hear where the leak is around the controller. Do another visual inspection, make sure you're not missing any spots. If anything looks kind of sketchy or not quite right, go ahead and put some silicone on it, wait for it to dry, and then test it again. As we can see here, the controller is good to go. When I press that on there and give it a press, it's not slowly inflating at all. Everything is good. We can start applying our seals back to the controller. We do include 2. It's very important not to touch the sticky side of these seals with your fingers or hands. Go ahead and sort of get it started with your fingernail or even the included pick. What I do is once it's started a little bit, go ahead, press that pick up against it and peel it right off, and then try and get it very accurately placed on that hole. Try not to stretch these seals. If they do get stretched, it could render them ineffective or not as effective, so make sure they don't get stretched or pulled. Just go ahead, press around the outside edges of it, and install it on the controller as well. Now we can start installing and putting our board back together. The really important part is the rails. We never want to slide these back in or outside of the rails, as it could scrape the excess silicone off of what we just waterproofed for the controller and the battery. So what I do is I like to start with the controller, get everything lined up. You'll see the screw holes here. Make sure they're lined up with the screw holes on your rail, and just slowly press it in. You never want to slide it in and out. You just want to sort of press this in just like this. Make sure those screw holes are lined up, and once it's fully set in there, I put in our warranty void screws back in to secure them and move on to the battery. So same thing with the battery. Make sure our gold screw head is lined up with our warranty void and just press it in there. This prevents us from scraping off that waterproofing around the edges if we were to just slide it into both of the rails at the same time. Go ahead and screw that in and we can move on to the other rail. So now we can just set the other rail on top. I find it's easiest. Line up the battery screw hole, give it a little press in there, make sure it's good. Check the front, make sure it's all lined up. Insert the screws, tighten them, and you can assemble your board as normal from there. Now we need to go ahead and open up the epoxy. Just remove the cap, put your needle together, and place the needle on top of there. Give it a twist to lock it in. Since this is a 2-part epoxy, what we need to do is go ahead and mix those together in the applicator by bleeding the line. So go ahead and just push quite a little bit out. Don't go super crazy and waste half the tube. The point of this is to make sure both of those are mixing together in the applicator. That way when we apply it, it dries completely. So the first thing we're going to need to do is to clean off our front foot pad sensor. You don't have to remove it from your board. You can do all of this while it's still attached. I just removed it for demonstration's sake. So all we got to do is go around the edges with our paper towel and our isopropyl alcohol. Just clean all the dirt and everything off of that and let it dry completely before we start epoxying it. So now we need to go ahead and seal the edges. So for the back, it's very important. You see this polycarbonate layer that the foot pad sensor is located in between. The grip tape is not directly on the edge of it. There's actually a lip. What we want to do is we want to seal it at the polycarbonate or the plastic layer rather than at that grip tape layer. So just go ahead, take your applicator, Don't go super heavy with it. This stuff flows like water, so make sure that you're not applying too much and it's dripping off the side of the foot pad. And make sure that you're covering both the sensor and the wood where they meet. That way no water can get in there. If it's only on the wood and not touching that plastic, it's not going to work. And vice versa, if it's only on that plastic and not touching the wood, it will not seal. Just make a small bead right across and just lay it down. Same thing as before with the sides. We don't really want to put it on the grip tape. We want to put it where the sensor meets the wood. That's what we're going to be sealing here. So just right on the corners as well, to be careful. Sometimes the corners can be a little bit chewed up on the foot pad, so you might have to use a little bit extra in those corners. But otherwise, same thing as always.
To those men who are going into the hottest spots, I hope that it will help you to do a better job.
Good to note to be careful when we get to the screw holes for the foot pad. Sometimes you can go a little bit overboard and actually get epoxy dripping into that hole, and you won't be able to screw your screw down all the way. Just make sure you're not using too much. Take your time in this area to really make sure you seal it. Try not to get too much on the grip tape, as it can make it a pain to remove later if you ever want to replace it. Just try and be very, very careful with that. Use it sparingly. Don't be afraid to apply it once, see that you've missed a spot, and then go back over it again later. So after you've done sealing up the edges and filled in any cracks that you want to cosmetically, be sure to lay this flat to have it dry. If you lay it at an angle, this epoxy does take 8 hours to dry, so it will actually drip and flow into incorrect positions. Just make sure it's completely flat when you let it to dry, and give it around 8 to 12 hours to fully cure before riding your board or reattaching it. This has been Austin with Onewheel Parts. As always, there will be a link to all the products used down in the description. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and head on over to onewheelparts.com for all your Onewheel accessory needs.